Okay, so I'm refuting Kyle's foo argument on the dropping of the 2 nuclear bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki led to a quicker end of the war that saved more lives than lost during the bombing. His secondary claims are Japan's national pride and war mentality leading to the belief in total extermination in order to save face. His second claim was casualties had the United States invaded Japan and the modern effects of the bombs and common misconceptions. Well, the national pride and war mentality, their will to fight was strong. However, this was propaganda-induced from the Japanese government. It was not a cultural thing. It was propaganda brought on by war. The United States did the same thing when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. They believed in a fate worse than death if they were ever captured by the Allies. And so taking Japanese soldiers alive as prisoners to the Allies was a risk to their lives rather than a duty of war, and soon many gave up. So it reinforced their statue of, well, if I get taken prisoner, they're gonna murder me, they're gonna torture me, they're gonna do all this other stuff, and that, it wasn't true. However, Dwight D. Eisenhower, the Supreme Commander of the Allied forces in Europe, noted, "I thought our country should avoid shocking the world opinion by the use of a weapon whose employment I thought no longer mandatory as a measure to save American lives." Saving American lives was based on the presumption that the United States would invade Japan. It was called Operation Downfall, and it was an all-out assault on Japan's mainland. And any assault on Japan's mainland would be utter suicide unless they were crippled. The naval blockade was crippling them already, and to use a weapon on a civilian population such as that was unnecessary. A demonstration may have been necessary, but why was it dropped over civilians? The bomb was used according to Admiral L. Lewis Strauss, Special Assistant to the Secretary of the Navy from 1944 to 1945. The weapon should be demonstrated over some area accessible to the Japanese observers, or its effects would be dramatic. A bomb detonated at a suitable height above a forest played the trees out in windrows from the center of the explosion in all directions as though they had been matchsticks. It seemed that a demonstration of this sort would prove the Japanese that we could destroy any of their fortifications at will. But we did it anyway. We wanted to prove to the world that we had the power, and it struck fear into them. However, the number of lives is based on the assumption that the Allies commenced Operation Downfall. However, that was not the only option they had. The Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. Fleet and Chief of Naval Operations, Ernest J. King, said the President, in giving his approval for these atomic attacks, appeared to believe that many thousands of American troops would be killed in invading Japan. And this he was entirely correct. But King felt, as he had pointed out many times, that the dilemma was an unnecessary one. For if we had been willing to wait, the effective naval blockade would, in course of time, have starved the Japanese into submission through lack of oil, rice, medicines, and other essential materials. It was Truman's decision to drop the bomb. He did it he was hasty to end the war. We had been in war for over 4 years. We defeated the Nazis in Germany, and we were having a stalemate in Japan. It was Truman's decision to drop the bomb. However, Henry H. Arnold, the commanding general of the U.S. Army Air Forces, stated he knew the Japanese wanted peace. There were political implications in the decision, and Arnold did not feel it was the military's job to question it. These political implications were basically a message to the Soviet Union that we have this weapon and we will fight to keep it. And for his final point, the final claim doesn't really add to the main argument of the modern effects of the bombs and common misconceptions. That really draws on the morality of the bomb and the justification for the morality. It's valid, but it's a value claim, and it doesn't fit in the facts. However, the main point of the bomb was not to save lives, it was to send a message to the entire world.
It's like not even letting go. I just can't. Like it physically won't come out of my mouth. Yeah. Life.
I just put them all over the table.
All right, you started off with an identification of the main and secondary claims, which is fine, but during the presentation, I didn't really hear arguments being applied specifically to those claims. It just seemed like there were general responses that were distinct from one another, but were not being particularly applied. So that's a little bit problematic when it comes to organization. I did think that you did a good job supplying information to support the conclusions that you were making. There were a couple of places where I think you had some questions that you raised legitimately. For instance, the whole thing about propaganda, well, that's an interesting point. How does the propaganda argument diminish the advocate's claim? Is the notion that it was really false, that the Japanese would be unwilling to surrender, or they were unwilling to cooperate and negotiate for peace, or something along those lines? I think you needed a little bit stronger implication for that argument to make much sense. I think randomly you've dropped in some pretty effective information. You've got Eisenhower as a critic of this. You've got the head of the United States Army Air Force as a critic of this. You've got one of the heads of the Navy as a critic of the decision, suggesting that it probably wasn't necessary and that there may have been alternative ways to demonstrate that. I think those arguments needed to be, there's not a problem with them being distributed the way they were, but I think it needs to be explained why they were put in the spots that you had them, because it didn't seem like they were addressing specific points that the advocate had brought up. The whole discussion of Operation Downfall and the claim that the naval blockade was going to be successful, there wasn't information on that point when you first brought it up. There was information later on a later point that talked about how effective the naval blockade was. Like you said at the end, it seems like there's a value argument based in here. The discussion of whether or not attacking civilian populations is appropriate, that's definitely a value claim. The question, though, is which saves the greater number of lives, both civilian and military lives, the dropping of the bomb, or would the naval blockade, which was in essence going to starve the Japanese as you described them, deny them access to fuels, and deny them access to medicines, is that going to create a greater number of deaths and that sort of thing? So it comes down to, if there was any data on those particular points, that would be helpful to have at that point so we can make a contrast and see. The final argument argues that that in large part it was also an attempt to demonstrate to the Soviets U.S. military abilities at this point in the war, and that's it. But that doesn't talk about the issue of whether or not that demonstration did in fact save lives, especially in that part of in that theater of war, whether or not Soviet ambitions in the East were limited because of U.S. presence, that sort of thing. That seems like it might have been an argument that could have been developed a little bit more also. But I did like the evidence that you had, and I thought, in general, your issues applied. I think they needed to be a little bit more organized and specified to the points that the advocate raised. All right, thank you.